twins write a letter and ask the hotel doctor, please, deliver it to apartment 1401. The billionaire reads it and is paralyzed. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the luxurious residential building as two small figures appeared at the entrance. The girls couldn't have been more than 5 years old, both blonde with light blue eyes that shone with determination. They held each other's hands, like a team facing an important mission. Emily, the taller one by a few inches, carried a crumpled white envelope. Sophie, more timid, hid slightly behind her sister, but her curious eyes took in everything around them. "Excuse me, sir," Emily said to the doorman, who looked at them with surprise from behind the marble counter. The man, accustomed only to elegant residents and well-dressed visitors, leaned down to hear them better. "Yes, little one. We want to deliver this." Emily held out the envelope. "Please, deliver it to Penthouse 1401. The doorman took the letter, noticing the childish handwriting on the address. The letters were crooked, some uppercase mixed with lowercase, as if two children had written it together. "Do you live here?" he asked, curious. The girls glanced at each other. "No," Sophie replied, finally speaking. "But our mommy said it's important. It's for our daddy," Emily added, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The doorman hesitated. It wasn't common for children to show up alone asking to deliver letters, but there was something so sincere in those blue eyes that made him agree. "All right, I'll deliver it." "Thank you," they both said at the same time, and ran off hand in hand. The doorman watched until they disappeared around the corner, then looked at the envelope again. "Forward to Penthouse 1401, the top floor, where Edward Haynes lived, 40 floors up." Edward was finishing his third business call before 9 in the morning. At 32, he had built a real estate empire that dominated the city of New York. His desk was covered in contracts, charts, and financial reports, his life summed up in numbers and profits. The phone rang again. "Edward Haynes," he answered without looking up from his papers. "Mr. Haynes, it's the front desk. I have a piece of mail for you." "Send it up," he said, already hanging up. Morning mail usually meant important documents or invitations to business events. Edward didn't even stop working when he heard the knock on the door. "Come in," he called out. But it was the doorman himself who appeared, holding the white envelope. "Sorry to bother you personally, Mr. Haynes, but two little girls brought this. They said it was for you, and, well, I thought it best to deliver it by hand." Edward finally looked up, frowning. "Girls?" "Yes, sir. Blonde, very young. They said it was for their father." Edward took the envelope, he already annoyed. It was probably some scheme to try and get money out of him. It wouldn't be the first time someone had used children in a pathetic attempt at manipulation. "Thank you," he said curtly, waiting for the doorman to leave. When he was alone, Edward examined the envelope. His name was written in a child's script, some letters upside down. It would have been almost funny if it weren't so obviously a poorly planned scam. He tore open the envelope without ceremony, expecting to find a request for money or some made-up story about medical needs. Instead, he found a sheet of plain paper with the same childish handwriting. "Hi. Our mommy said you are our daddy. We want to meet you, Emily and Sophie." Edward stood still, reading the message 3 times. Then he started to laugh, a cold sound that echoed through the empty office. "What a joke," he muttered. "Him, a father? Impossible." The doctors had been very clear years ago. He was sterile, a condition discovered during routine exams when he was 25. The news had come as a relief at the time. No children meant he could dedicate himself completely to his business, without distractions or extra responsibilities. And now, 2 children showed up out of nowhere with a letter saying he was their father. Obviously, their mother had found his address and concocted this ridiculous plan. Edward crumpled the paper, ready to throw it in the trash. But something made him stop. Emily and Sophie. The names echoed strangely in his mind. There was something about the simplicity of the letter, the genuinely childish handwriting, that didn't seem like an elaborate scam. 5-year-old children couldn't act that well. He smoothed the paper out again, rereading the words. "Our mommy said you are our daddy." Who was this mother? Edward tried to remember any woman who might have a reason to invent such a story. In recent years, his relationships had been superficial and brief, women more interested in his money than in him. But 5 years ago, Edward leaned back in his chair, forcing his memory. 5 years ago, he was still building his empire, working 16-hour days. He had been in a few more serious relationships back then, but nothing that could result in... He stopped. There was one person. Someone he had pushed away because of work. Someone who... No, he said aloud, shaking his head. He was sterile. Doctors didn't make mistakes about that sort of thing. And even if they did, any woman would have come after him much sooner, especially after he became wealthy. Edward looked out the window, watching the city move 40 floors below. People like tiny ants, all with their small problems. He had built his life away from such complications, away from attachments that could disrupt his plans. But the letter was still there, in his hand. "We want to meet you." Why did those simple words affect him? Edward prided himself on being immune to emotional manipulation. He had built walls around his heart that even he hadn't been able to tear down for years. Still, he pictured 2 little blonde girls handing the letter to the doorman, saying it was for their father, the determination the doorman had described, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Edward folded the letter carefully and put it in his desk drawer. Not because he believed it, of course, just so he wouldn't lose the evidence when he decided to take legal action against this ridiculous extortion attempt. But as he returned to his work, trying to focus on numbers and reports, an image persisted in his mind. 2 little girls, hand in hand, walking up to the most elegant building in the city to deliver a letter to the father they had never met. And for the first time in years, Edward Haynes found he couldn't get something out of his head. 3 days had passed since the letter was delivered, and Edward had almost managed to forget about it. Almost. The word almost irritated him deeply, because Edward Haynes was not a man to let loose ends disturb his meticulous routine. During those 3 days, he had tried to maintain his normal schedule. Meetings at 7 in the morning, contract reviews until noon, international calls until 6 in the evening. The routine he had built to keep his mind occupied and away from unnecessary distractions. But the letter was still there, tucked away in his desk drawer, like an annoying reminder of an unresolved issue. As much as he tried to focus on the numbers and charts, his mind kept drifting back to that childish handwriting and the simple words that had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. On Thursday morning, while reviewing the blueprint for a new shopping mall that promised to generate millions in profit, his intercom buzzed. Edward answered without taking his eyes off the projected figures on his computer screen. "Mr. Haynes." The doorman's voice sounded hesitant, almost nervous. "What is it?" he replied with the typical impatience of someone who dislikes being interrupted during work. "The girls are here again, sir." Edward stopped typing. His hands hovered over the keyboard as if time had frozen. "What girls?" "The same ones from Monday, Mr. Haynes. The ones who brought the letter. They said they're going to wait for you to come down." Edward shot up from his chair abruptly, knocking some papers over in the process. The documents scattered across the floor, but he didn't even notice. "What do you mean, wait for me to come down? How old are they again?" "They look about 5 size, sir, very small, but they're very determined." "I've never seen such resolute children." "Determined?" Edward almost laughed at the absurdity. "They're 5-year-old kids. What do they know about determination?" "Yes, sir, but they're sitting quietly on the lobby sofa, and they said they won't leave until they talk to you." "They've been here for over an hour." Edward felt his blood pressure rise. The day was starting to completely unravel. "An hour? And you haven't done anything? You haven't called anyone?" "I've tried everything, Mr. Haynes. I offered them water, cookies, asked if they wanted me to call someone, but they just say they came alone and that they need to talk to their father. They insist that you are their father. This is completely ridiculous." Edward slammed his hand on the desk, making the monitor wobble dangerously. "Call the police, or social services, or whoever is responsible for these children." "I tried to suggest that, sir, but they say they know very well where they are and that their mother knows exactly where they've gone. They seem very sure of themselves." Edward took a deep breath, trying to control the anger rising in his chest like volcanic lava. This was enough. This farce had gone on long enough. "I'm coming down now," he said, slamming the phone down hard. He walked to the elevator with heavy steps, pressing the button with more force than necessary. During the descent, his irritation grew with each passing floor. He tried to organize his thoughts. To prepare his speech, he would be direct and firm. Whoever was behind this charade had crossed a red line. Using children to try to extort money from him was too low, even by the standards of the con artists who had tried to deceive him over the years. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor with a soft ding, and Edward marched towards the lobby with firm steps, already preparing the intimidating speech he would use to resolve this situation. But when he finally saw the two little girls sitting on the Italian leather sofa, something inside him hesitated. An almost imperceptible tremor ran through his chest. They were real, very real, and even smaller than he had imagined. Two little blondes with crystal-clear blue eyes, swinging their little legs that barely reached the floor from the high sofa, whispering to each other. Emily, the slightly taller one, wore a simple blue dress that looked well cared for but was visibly a bit too big for her small frame. Sophie wore a similar dress in light pink, with a small, neatly sewn patch on the right knee. Both of their blonde hairs were tied in slightly lopsided pigtails. There was something genuinely touching about the scene. Two children so small, sitting with their backs straight, waiting patiently like adults in a waiting room. But they were still children. Sophie fidgeted nervously with her hands, and Emily observed everything around her with intense curiosity. When they noticed him approaching, they both stood up at the same time, like little soldiers snapping to attention. The movement was so synchronized that Edward almost smiled. "Are you Edward?" Emily asked, lifting her small chin and looking directly at him without any sign of fear. Edward stopped in front of them, trying to maintain the serious and intimidating expression that worked so effectively in business meetings. But these two little ones didn't seem impressed. On the contrary, they watched him with genuine curiosity. "I am Edward Haynes," he said, using his most formal tone. "And you are trespassing on private property." The girls glanced at each other quickly, confused by the legal term. "What's private property?" Sophie asked, tilting her little head to the side. Edward blinked. He wasn't prepared to explain legal concepts to 5-year-olds. "It means you can't be here without permission," he said, trying to simplify. "This is a private building, only for residents." "But we just want to talk to you," Emily said. "Our mommy said you're our daddy." And there it was, the bombshell Edward had expected but which still caught him off guard. Hearing it in person from the mouths of two such small children made the situation feel much more real than a crumpled letter. "Your mother is completely mistaken," he said, crossing his arms. "I don't have children. I can't have children. It's impossible." "Why?" Sophie asked with that persistent curiosity of children. "Because medically it's not possible." Edward felt the absurdity of the situation. He, one of the most powerful men in the city, was explaining fertility issues to two 5-year-olds. "I'm sterile." The girls looked at him, not understanding. "What's sterile?" Emily asked, pronouncing each syllable carefully. Edward ran a hand over his face. How had he gotten to this ridiculous point? "It means I can't have children," he explained, feeling foolish. "But our mommy said you're our daddy," Emily insisted, with that typical childhood stubbornness. "And my mommy never lies to us. She always tells the truth about everything." "Your mother is mistaken this time," Edward said, raising his voice more than he intended. Sophie took a small step back, startled by his tone, but Emily stood her ground. "No, she's not," Emily said, her eyes starting to well up with tears she refused to shed. "She said you're very busy with work, but that you are our daddy." Edward turned to the doorman, who was watching everything with an embarrassed expression. "Call social services immediately," he ordered. "These children have been abandoned and need assistance." "We're not abandoned," Emily shouted. "Our mommy is at work. She said we could come talk to you." "Working where exactly?" At the place where she works," Sophie said, uncertain, looking to her sister for support. Edward rolled his eyes. The children had obviously been coached not to give specific information. "Enough of this whole charade," he said, turning to go back to the elevator. "I get out of here before I call the police for real." "Wait," Emily yelled, and there was something in her desperate tone that made Edward stop. When he turned around, he saw the girl was holding a small rectangular photo. "My mommy said to give this to you," Emily said, holding out the photo with a trembling little hand. Edward hesitated for a long moment. Part of him wanted to ignore it and go up to his apartment, but curiosity was stronger. He took the small photo, expecting to see the face of some opportunistic stranger. Instead, the world came to a complete stop. It was Clara Morrison, with that radiant smile that used to light up any room she was in. Her light brown hair falling over her shoulders, the bright green eyes he knew better than his own. It was a recent photo, but she was exactly as Edward remembered, perhaps a little more mature, but still the same Clara who had occupied his thoughts for years. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably. Clara, the only woman he had ever truly loved, without reservation. The only one who had managed to break through all his defenses and make him think about something other than work. The only person he had lost because he was young, stupid, and obsessed with building his empire. 5 years. It had been exactly 5 years since she walked out of his life forever, tired of competing with meetings and contracts. 5 years since he chose a crucial investor presentation over her birthday. 5 years since she said she loved him more than anything, but couldn't be in second place anymore. Edward looked up from the photo and really looked at the two girls. This time he truly saw them, without the barrier of skepticism he had maintained. Emily's eyes, light blue like his, but with tiny flecks of gold around the pupil, exactly like his were as a child. The shape of Sophie's face, the slightly square chin, the line of her jaw. Features he saw in the mirror every day. The way Emily lifted her chin when she was determined, the exact same gesture he made in difficult meetings. Sophie's stubborn persistence as she continued to look at him without blinking, just like himself as a child. "No," Edward muttered, shaking his head. "No, no, no." But the evidence was right there, not just in Clara's photo, but in the faces of the two little girls who watched him with intense expectation. "Sisa mommy said you work a lot," Sophie said, breaking the silence. "But she said you're nice when you can stop thinking about work for 5 minutes." Edward swallowed hard. Clara had said those exact words years ago, during one of their last arguments, that he was a different person, kind, funny, caring, when he switched off his business brain. Did she say anything else about me?" he asked, hating how weak his voice sounded. "She said you like chocolate ice cream with brownie chunks," Emily replied, "and that you sometimes sing in the shower when you're happy." Edward felt the floor sway. Clara was the only person who knew about those intimate quirks, the only one who had shared lazy Sunday mornings with him before his obsession with work destroyed everything. "She also said you would deny being our daddy," Sophie continued with brutal honesty, "but that deep down you would really want to get to know us." Edward looked at the photo again. Clara was smiling, but there was something melancholic in her green eyes, as if she knew this conversation would be difficult for everyone. 5 years ago, the girls were 5 years old now, and he had broken up with Clara exactly 5.5 years ago. "No," he said aloud, backing away from the children. "This doesn't prove anything at all." But his voice sounded desperate, even to himself. "The doctors said I was sterile," he continued, more to convince himself. "Specialists don't make mistakes about this. It's science, not opinion." "Maybe they were wrong this time," Emily said with devastating simplicity. Edward looked at her, then at Sophie, then at Clara's photo. Clara seemed to be smiling directly at him through time. "This proves nothing," he repeated, handing the photo back to Emily with unnecessary force. But even as he denied it, he couldn't stop looking for resemblances in the girls' faces. And the more he looked, the more he found. "You need to go home now," he said, trying to regain control. "Immediately." "But you haven't said if you want to meet us yet," Sophie protested, with relentless childlike logic. Edward closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the two were still there, looking at him expectantly. "My mommy said you always run away when you're scared," Emily said suddenly. Edward froze, staring at the girl. "I don't run away from anything in my life." "Then why are you leaving without talking to us properly?" Emily asked, crossing her little arms. The question hung in the air like a direct challenge. Edward opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Why was he running away? Because two unknown children had appeared claiming to be his daughters, and that was impossible. Because he had built his life on the certainty that he couldn't have children. Because Clara had come back in the most unexpected way. Because he was terrified. Edward looked at Emily and Sophie, who were waiting for an answer. Their blue eyes reflected a determination he recognized, even as he denied it. "Where do you live?" he asked suddenly. The girls looked at each other. "Not too far from here," Emily said. "We walked." "Alone?" "Two 5-year-olds walking alone." "Our mommy said we were brave enough," Sophie answered with pride. Edward ran a hand through his hair. Two 5-year-olds walking alone through the streets of Queens to find a father they didn't even know existed. It was crazy. It was dangerous. It was exactly the kind of desperate thing Clara would do if she had no other options. "All right," Edward said, surprising himself. "All right, I'll go with you." "You will?" Emily asked, her eyes shining with hope. "I will," Edward confirmed, still not quite believing it. "And I need to see your mother." The walk took only 15 minutes, but for Edward it felt like an eternity. The two girls, Emily and Sophie, skipped beside him on the sidewalks, pointing at shops and cars, chatting to each other as if it were the most natural outing in the world. Edward, meanwhile, felt each step like a march into the unknown. Along the way, he watched the girls with renewed attention. The way Emily swung her arms as she walked was identical to his as a child. His mother always used to comment on it. Sophie had a habit of furrowing her brow when she was concentrating, just as he did during important meetings. Small details that disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. They left the upscale area of Midtown, where his building was sketchy, and entered a simpler neighborhood in Queens. The houses were smaller, older, but well kept. Small gardens, older cars parked on the street, children playing on the sidewalks. A world completely different from the one Edward knew. "This is it," Emily announced, pointing to a small 2-story house, painted white with blue trim that needed a fresh coat. Edward stopped in front of the simple iron gate, observing the residence. There was a small front garden with flowers that looked like they had been planted with care, but now showed clear signs of neglect. The curtains in the main window were drawn, giving the house an air of privacy. Everything about it screamed simplicity, the opposite of his luxurious life. Sophie opened the gate, which had no lock, Edward noted, and ran towards the front door. "Mommy! Mommy! Edward came with us. He's here!" Edward hesitated at the gate. There was still time to turn back, to escape this situation that promised to turn his life upside down. But Emily looked at him expectantly. "Aren't you coming in? Mommy's waiting." Before he could answer, the front door opened, and there she was. Clara Morrison appeared on the doorstep wearing a simple cotton dress, a moss green that highlighted her eyes. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she looked thinner than Edward remembered, almost fragile. But she was still unmistakably the same woman who had occupied his thoughts for years. When their eyes met, time stood completely still. "Edward," she said, her voice carrying a complex mixture of surprise, resignation, and something he couldn't quite identify. "Clara," he replied, his throat feeling dry. The girls ran to their mother, each holding one of her hands. "He came, Mommy, he came to meet us," Sophie said excitedly. Clara looked down at her daughters, then back at Edward with intensity. There was a firmness in her face that he didn't remember seeing before. "Come in," she said, stepping back from the door. "We need to talk properly." Edward walked through the small garden and entered the house. The interior was simple but cozy. A small living room with a floral fabric sofa, a light wood coffee table with a few scratches from use, photos of the girls scattered on the wall in cheap but carefully arranged frames. It was all very different from the minimalist luxury of his apartment. "You can go play in your room," Clara said to the girls. "Mommy needs to talk to Edward about grown-up things." "But we want to stay and listen," Emily protested. "Not now, sweetie. You can come back later, if he wants. But first, he and I need to talk alone." There was a natural authority in Clara's voice that made the girls obey immediately. They ran up the stairs, leaving the two adults alone in the tension-filled room. A heavy silence settled between them. Edward watched Clara more closely. She looked tired and with small lines around her eyes that weren't there 5 years ago. Her clothes were simple, well cared for, but visibly inexpensive, and there was a determination in her posture that he didn't recognize. "Why now?" Edward asked, breaking the silence. "Joyce, after 5 years, do you decide to do this?" Clara sat on the sofa, gesturing for him to take an armchair. Edward remained standing. "Sit down, Edward. We need to talk like adults." "I'd rather stand. Answer my question." Clara sighed, running a hand through her hair. They started asking about their father, Emily especially. She saw other kids at school being picked up by their dads and wanted to know why she and Sophie didn't have one. "And you decided to make up a story that I was their father." Clara's green eyes narrowed. "Make up? Edward, they're your daughters. I didn't make anything up. I told them the truth I should have told a long time ago." "That's completely impossible," Edward began, pacing the room like a caged animal. "You know very well I can't have children. The doctors were adamant about it." "They were wrong, Edward. Medical specialists don't make mistakes about this kind of thing." Clara stood up too and facing him. "Yes, they do. And the proof is upstairs, playing in their room." Edward stopped in front of her, his eyes flashing with anger. "You're lying. I don't know what game this is, but I'm not falling for this setup." "Setup?" Clara's voice rose a notch. "You think I would spend 5 years raising 2 children alone just to set up a scam? I don't know what your motives are, but I know this story is impossible." Clara stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head with sadness and exasperation. "You haven't changed at all, have you? Still the same arrogant man who only believes what he wants to believe, ignoring reality. I believe in scientific facts, and the fact is, I'm sterile. The fact is, you have 2 5-year-old daughters upstairs. Prove it." "How?" Clara opened her arms in frustration. "What do you want me to do? They look like you, Edward." "Anyone can see the resemblance immediately." Edward let out a bitter laugh. "Resemblances can be a coincidence, or you could have chosen their father because he looked like me." Clara turned pale. "How dare you say something like that?" "Because I know you, Clara. I always knew how your mind works when you want something." Clara's hand flew towards Edward's face, but he caught her wrist before she could slap him. "Don't you dare accuse me of that," she said, trembling with rage. "Don't you dare suggest I would use my daughters that way." Edward released her wrist but didn't back away. "Then explain to me why you waited 5 years. Why didn't you come to me when you found out you were pregnant?" Clara moved away, going to the window. "Because I knew you. I knew exactly how you would react. I knew you would doubt me, accuse me, do exactly what you're doing now. And that didn't give me the right to know and choose." "What choice?" Clara turned to him. "The choice to tell me it was impossible. The choice to accuse me of trying to trap you. You had already made it clear that work was more important than anything in your life. That didn't give you the right to hide this from me." "Hide what?" "Daughters you insist aren't yours." Edward ran his hands through his hair, exasperated. "Clara, be reasonable. You know my medical limitations. Your medical limitations are running around upstairs. The doctors said I was sterile." "The doctors were wrong," Clara shouted, losing her patience. "For God's sake, Edward, doctors are human. They can be wrong." "Not about something so basic. They can be wrong about this too." She was pacing agitatedly now. "Must you want to cling to that diagnosis so badly, because it always gave you the perfect excuse to never commit to anything?" Edward tensed. "That has nothing to do with—" "It has everything to do with it," Clara interrupted him. "You've always used that sterility as a shield, as an excuse to never have to choose between work and family, because family was never going to be an option anyway. You don't know what you're talking about. I know perfectly well. I knew you, Edward. I knew how you worked. And when I found out I was pregnant, I knew you would find a way to deny it, to run from the responsibility. So why are you doing this now? Why did you bring the girls to me?" Clara stopped and faced him. "Because they asked about their father, because Emily wanted to know why she didn't have a daddy like the other kids. They asked, and I didn't want to hide it anymore. They deserve to know who you are. You could have made up any story. I could have. But they deserve to know the truth about their father, even if you never acknowledge them as your daughters. Edward watched Clara. There was an iron determination in her that he had never seen before. The woman in front of him was no longer the young woman who had fallen in love with him. She was a mother, a woman who had faced 5 years alone raising 2 children. "Mom, you're unemployed," he said suddenly, noticing the details of the house, the simple clothes, the tension on her face. Clara lifted her chin. "I am. I lost my job 3 months ago. But that has nothing to do with them seeking you out." "Doesn't it? How convenient. You lose your job and suddenly my supposed daughters show up at my door. You're despicable," Clara said, her voice low but charged with emotion. "You always were, but now you've managed to be even worse. I'm a realist, and realistically, this whole story is a big lie." "You know what's a lie, Edward." Clara moved closer to him. "A lie is you pretending not to see their resemblance to you. A lie is you using a medical diagnosis to deny the reality that's right in front of you. The reality is that I can't have children. The reality is that you have 2 daughters. And while you were hiding behind your work, while you were building your empire, I spent 5 years raising them alone. 5 years of sleepless nights, fevers, first steps, first words that you missed." Clara's voice was choked with 5 years of resentment and pain. 5 years of watching them grow up without a father, wondering why they were different from other children. 5 years explaining that Daddy was too busy to visit, when in reality Daddy didn't even know they existed because it was easier that way. And while you hid behind your work, you missed 5 years of their lives. Edward stood in silence, watching the pain on Clara's face. "And now you come here and accuse me of a setup as if I planned all this. As if having daughters was some kind of prize I wanted to snatch from you." "Clara." "No," she cut him off. "Let me finish. I don't want anything from you, Edward. Not money, not recognition, not anything. I just wanted them to know who their father is. I wanted to give them the chance to meet you, even knowing you would probably reject them. I'm not rejecting anyone. You're just being yourself. The same man who chose work over me. The same man who could never commit to anything that didn't turn a profit." Edward felt as if he had been punched in the gut. "That's not fair." "Fair?" Clara laughed humorlessly. "You know what's not fair. Raising 2 children alone. Working 2 jobs to support a family. Explaining to your daughters why they can't have the things other kids have. If you had told me." "What?" "You would have helped. Even believing they aren't yours. Even being sure I was lying." Edward didn't answer. "That's what I thought," Clara said, her voice returning to a calm tone. "You're still the same man who lost the woman he loved because he couldn't stop working long enough to be present. I loved you." Loved. Past tense. And even then, it wasn't enough for you to change. Edward looked at her, at the simple living room, at the pictures of the girls on the wall. "I don't believe they are my daughters," he said finally. Clara nodded as if she had expected this answer. "I know. Your suspicion was always stronger than any emotion. That's why you lost 5 years of their lives, Edward. And that's why you'll continue to lose." They were silent for a moment. From upstairs, they could hear the girls' laughter as they played. "What do you want from me?" Edward asked. "Nothing," Clara replied. "Absolutely nothing. You can leave now if you want. I'll explain to them that you were too busy to stay." Edward glanced at the stairs, then at Clara. "What if I do a DNA test?" Clara stared at him. "Do it. But when the result comes back positive, don't come here expecting me to make things easy. They will grow up knowing who you really are, a man who doubted them before he even tried to know them." Edward nodded slowly. "I'll do the test." "Do it." He walked towards the door, then stopped. "Clara? What? Why did you never tell me you were pregnant?" Clara was silent for a long moment. "Because I knew you would react exactly as you did today. And they always deserved more than that." Edward left the house without another word, leaving Clara alone in the small living room, listening to her daughter's laughter from upstairs. Edward left Clara's house with his mind in total turmoil. All the way back to his building, her words echoed in his head like a persistent refrain. They were wrong. And while you were hiding behind your work, you missed 5 years of their lives. The next day, first thing in the morning, He called his private doctor, Dr. Martinez. Edward Haynes, I need a DNA test done urgently. Of course, Mr. Haynes. May I ask the reason? Edward hesitated. How could he explain that two children had appeared out of nowhere, claiming to be his daughters? Family matters. Can you arrange everything discreetly? Absolutely. I'll arrange for a private lab. When can you bring the other party? Today, if possible. Dr. Martinez arranged everything for the afternoon. Edward called Clara, keeping his tone cold and professional. I need you to take the girls to the lab today at 3. That was fast, Clara said, with no surprise in her voice. Already have it all arranged. I want to get this over with. Of course you do. Address? Edward gave her the information and hung up. There was nothing more to say until the results came in. The lab was discreet and elegant, located in a private clinic in the city center. Edward arrived first, nervous in a way he hadn't felt in years. When Clara entered with Emily and Sophie, he watched the three of them with renewed attention. The girls seemed curious but not scared. Clara had explained that they were just having a simple test, nothing more. It's just a little bit of saliva, the technician explained, showing them the small tubes. It doesn't hurt at all. Emily went first, cooperative and curious about the whole process. Sophie was a little more hesitant, but followed her sister's lead. Edward had his test done in silence, watching the girls from the corner of his eye. The results will be ready in a week, the technician informed them. A whole week. Edward didn't know if he could wait that long. During that week, something strange happened. Edward found himself thinking about the girls constantly, not just about the possibility of them being his daughters, but about them as small individual people. On Wednesday, he was in an important meeting when he remembered how Emily had lifted her chin when she was determined to deliver the letter. On Thursday, during an international call, he thought about the way Sophie fidgeted nervously with her hands. On Friday, why he did something he had never done before. He left the office early and drove to the girls' school. He didn't go in, just stayed in the car watching the children leave. When he saw Emily and Sophie running towards Clara, who was waiting for them at the gate, something stirred in his chest. They were so small, so full of energy and life, and maybe they really were his, but no, he couldn't think like that. The test would prove he was right. It had to. On Saturday, Edward woke up early and instead of going to the office as he always did, he drove to a park near Clara's house. He hadn't planned it. He just found himself there. To his surprise, he saw Clara walking with the girls. They were playing in the children's area while Clara sat on a bench reading a book. Edward watched from a distance, hidden behind a tree like a spy. Emily was clearly the leader. She would climb on the playground equipment first, test if it was safe, then call for Sophie to follow her. Sophie was more cautious, more observant. She would study each piece of equipment for a while before deciding if she wanted to play on it. The two of them looked after each other naturally. When Sophie tripped and scraped her knee, Emily immediately ran to help her, calling for Clara. When Emily got stuck at the top of a slide because she was afraid to come down, Sophie stood at the bottom, encouraging her. Edward watched for 2 hours, fascinated by the dynamic between them. They were definitely sisters, that much he could see. But were they his daughters? On Monday, he couldn't concentrate on work. Every time the phone rang, his heart leaped. Was it the lab? On Tuesday, the same thing. Meetings passed without him paying attention. Contracts went unreviewed. His assistant commented that he seemed distracted. On Wednesday morning, the phone finally rang. Mr. Haynes, Dr. Martinez, the results are in. Edward's heart stopped. And? Can you come to my office? I'd prefer to deliver them in person. Just tell me over the phone. There was a pause. Mr. Haynes, the test was positive, a 99.9% certainty. The girls are your biological daughters. The world stopped. Edward sat down heavily in his chair, the phone still glued to his ear. For a long moment, he couldn't process the words. Mr. Haynes, are you there? I'm here, Edward said, his voice hoarse. Are you sure? Absolutely. There's no margin for error. Emily and Sophie are your daughters. Edward hung up the phone and sat in complete silence for 15 minutes. For the first time in many years, perhaps decades. Edward Haynes felt the ground completely disappear from under his feet. He had daughters. 2 5-year-old daughters he had rejected, doubted, and accused of being the product of lies. 2 daughters who had been raised for 5 years without him. 2 daughters he knew absolutely nothing about. His hands trembled as he held the medical report Dr. Martinez had sent by email. There it was. In cold, precise scientific language, Edward Haynes was the biological father of Emily and Sophie Morrison. Clara was right. The doctors had been wrong about his sterility, and he had wasted 5 whole years of his daughters' lives because he refused to consider that possibility. Edward cancelled all his meetings for the day and drove immediately to Clara's house. He rang the doorbell with his hands still shaking. Clara opened the door and, seeing his expression, understood immediately. The results came in. They did, Edward confirmed, his voice coming out weaker than he intended. And you were right. They're my daughters. Clara showed no surprise or satisfaction. She just nodded. I know. How did you always know? How were you so sure? Because I was never with anyone but you back then, Edward. You were the only man in my life. The simplicity of her answer hit him like a slap. Of course, Clara had never lied to him in all the years they had known each other. Why would she start now? Can I see them? Clara hesitated. They're playing in the backyard. But Edward, now that you know the truth, what are you planning to do? I don't know, he admitted with brutal honesty. I really don't know. Clara studied him for a moment, then opened the door completely. Come in, but take it slow. To them, you're still a stranger. Edward entered the house and walked to the back door. Through the kitchen window, he could see Emily and Sophie playing with dolls in the small grassy backyard. They had created an imaginary house under a tree and were having a make-believe tea party. His daughters. The words still sounded impossible in his mind. Can I talk to them? Clara nodded and opened the back door. Girls, you have a visitor. Emily and Sophie looked up and smiled when they saw Edward. Edward! Sophie shouted, running to him. Did you come to play with us? Edward looked at Clara for guidance, but she just watched. I came to talk to you. About what? Emily asked, always direct. Edward crouched down to their level. How did you tell 2 5-year-olds that you were their father? Remember that test we took? The 2 nodded. Well, the results showed that I really am your daddy. Emily and Sophie looked at each other, then at him. We already knew, Emily said simply. Mommy told us. So are you going to live here with us now? Sophie asked, hopeful. Edward felt his chest tighten. I don't know yet, Sophie. It's complicated. Why is it complicated? Emily crossed her little arms. You're our dad. We're your daughters. It's not complicated. The childlike logic hit him hard. For them, it really wasn't complicated. Do you want some things? Edward asked, feeling lost. Toys? Clothes? What kind of toys? Sophie asked, interested. Edward thought quickly. Anything you want. Expensive dolls, games, new bicycles. The girls' eyes lit up. Real bicycles? Emily asked. The most expensive ones in the store, Edward promised, feeling on more familiar ground. Money, he understood. And video games too, and pretty clothes. Wow, Sophie said, clapping her hands. Clara, who had been watching the whole conversation from the doorway, approached. Edward, can I talk to you for a minute? They moved to the corner of the yard. What are you doing? Clara asked, her voice low. I'm trying to, I don't know, make up for lost time. With money. It's what I know how to do, Clara. They don't need expensive gifts. They need a present father. I don't know how to be a present father, Edward said, frustration leaking into his voice. I never had to learn. I never thought I would need to learn. Clara studied him with an expression that mixed pity and exasperation. Then learn now. Start slow. Stay here. Play with them. Talk to them. Just be yourself, but the better version of yourself. Edward returned to where the girls were waiting. So, about those bicycles, he said. How about we go to the store tomorrow? Really? They both shouted at the same time. Really? And then we can have lunch at a fancy restaurant. "Do you know what a fancy restaurant is?" The girls shook their heads, excited. "I'll show you. And then we can go to the mall to buy new clothes and toys. Anything you want." As he spoke, Edward noticed the girls' initial excitement starting to wane. Sophie was fidgeting with her hands, and Emily was biting her lip. "You don't want to?" he asked, confused. "We do," Emily said hesitantly. But what?" "Are you going to leave afterward?" Sophie asked, her voice small. The question caught him off guard. "Will I have to work?" "Everyone works," Emily said. "Mommy works, but she doesn't leave." Edward looked at Clara, who was watching with an expression he couldn't interpret. "I'm not leaving forever," he said, trying to sound convincing. I'll visit you." "When?" Sophie asked. "When I can. Weekends, maybe." The girls were silent for a moment. "Okay," Emily said finally, but the enthusiasm was gone from her voice. "Can we still get the bicycles?" Edward felt a strange tightness in his chest, a feeling that he had said something wrong, but he didn't know what. "Of course you can. I'll buy you anything you want." But as the girls went back to playing, he noticed they didn't seem as excited anymore. They whispered to each other, casting occasional glances in his direction. Clara approached again. "They're disappointed," she said quietly. "Why? I promised them everything they wanted." "Edward, they don't want your things. They want you." "But I said I'll visit. When you can't, weekends, maybe." Clara shook her head. You don't get it at all, do you?" Edward looked at the girls, then at Clara. "What did I do wrong? I'm trying to do what I can. You're trying to buy their love instead of building a real relationship. You're offering things instead of offering yourself." "But I don't know how to offer myself," Edward burst out, his voice low. "I don't know how to be a father, Clara. I never learned how—" Clara looked at him with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Then you'd better learn fast, because now you have 2 daughters who need a real father, not a rich man who shows up once in a while with presents." Edward watched Emily and Sophie playing in the yard. They had gone back to their playhouse game, but the mood had changed. They spoke quietly, without their earlier energy. He had managed to disappoint them in less than 10 minutes of officially being their father. "How do I fix this?" he asked, genuinely lost. "You sit down there on the grass and play with them. Forget about the presents for a minute and just be present. Literally present." Edward looked at the grassy ground, then at his expensive suit. "I'll get my clothes dirty." Clara sighed deeply. "Edward, if you're more worried about your suit than your daughter's, then you still don't understand what it means to be a father." Edward stood still for a long moment, watching the girls. Then, slowly, he walked over to where they were and sat on the grass, not caring about the suit. "Can I play house with you?" he asked. Emily and Sophie looked at each other, surprised. "Do you know how to play house?" Sophie asked. "No," Edward admitted. "How can you teach me?" For the first time since he'd known he was a father, Edward saw genuine smiles return to his daughters' faces. Maybe there was hope, after all. Edward left Clara's house on Saturday afternoon feeling more confused than ever. He had spent 2 hours playing house with Emily and Sophie, and although they had smiled and seemed to have fun, something was still not right. There was a subtle distance, a hesitation in the girls that he couldn't understand. On Sunday morning, he decided to return with the promised bicycles. He had woken up early and driven to the most expensive toy store in the city, choosing 2 pink bicycles with baskets and colorful ribbons. They cost more than many people earned in a month, but for Edward, it was just another transaction. When he arrived at Clara's house with the bicycles strapped to the roof of his imported car, the girls ran to the window, excited. But Clara came out of the house before he could even get the bikes off the car. "Edward, we need to talk," she said, with a firmness in her voice he hadn't heard since they were dating. "Sure, but first let me give the bikes to them. Just look at these beauties I bought." "The bicycles can wait. Come inside." There was something in Clara's tone that made Edward hesitate. She didn't seem angry, exactly, but there was a determination in her green eyes that made him uncomfortable. "The girls are waiting. The girls are at the neighbors playing. They'll be there for an hour. Come in, Edward." "Now?" He followed her into the small house, noticing she had arranged the living room more formally. The sofa cushions were lined up. There were no toys scattered about, and there were 2 cups of coffee on the coffee table. "Sit down," Clara said, indicating the armchair where he had sat the week before. Edward sat Mo, but Clara remained standing, pacing slowly around the room. It was a tactic he recognized from business meetings. The person standing maintains psychological control of the situation. "Clara, if this is about money for the girls—" "Stop," she interrupted him, raising her hand. "Just stop talking and listen to me for 5 minutes. Can you do that?" Edward nodded, surprised by her direct tone. Clara stopped in front of the window, looking out for a moment before turning to him. "You bought $1,000 bicycles for 2 5-year-olds. I wanted to give them the best." "No, you wanted to buy their love. And before you say that's not it, just listen to me until the end." Edward closed his mouth, recognizing that she was serious in a way he had rarely seen. "Yesterday, after you left, Emily asked me if the new daddy was going to leave forever like the old daddy. I told her you weren't an old daddy, that you were always their father. Do you know what she said?" Edward shook his head. "She said, 'But he doesn't seem to want to stay with us. He just wants to give us things and then go to work.'" The words hit Edward like a punch to the stomach. "She's 5 years old, Edward. 5 years old, and she already understands that you're trying to buy your way back into their lives instead of building a real relationship." Clara came closer and sat on the edge of the coffee table, forcing Edward to look directly at her. Sophie was even more direct. She asked if all rich daddies were like that, if they only showed up to give presents and then disappeared again. "I'm not going to disappear. Aren't you?" Clara tilted her head. "Then tell me, how many times a week do you plan to see them?" "Well, weekends, when possible." "When possible," Clara repeated, with bitterness. "Just like you used to do with me, remember? I'll see you this weekend, Clara, when possible. I have an important meeting on Monday, a contract to close on Tuesday." Edward felt his blood run cold. The words were almost identical to the ones he used to say to Clara years ago. "This is different." "Is it?" Clara stood up and started pacing the room again. "Is it different because now it's your daughters instead of your girlfriend? Or is it different because now you have more money to compensate for your absence?" "Clara, I'm trying." "You're trying to do the same thing you've always done." She turned to him, her eyes shining with frustration. "You're trying to solve an emotional problem with money and empty promises." Edward stood up too, feeling defensive. "The promises aren't empty. I'm going to be present in their lives." "When possible," Clara repeated sarcastically. "Edward, you've never lacked money. Never. You've always had enough to buy whatever you wanted, to solve any problem that could be solved with money." She stopped in front of him, looking directly into his eyes. "But you know what you've always lacked? Presence. Your real, genuine, consistent presence. And if you don't learn that now, you're going to lose them before you even really know them." The words echoed in the small room like an ultimatum. "I lost you because I didn't know how to balance work and a relationship," Clara continued. "Because I always thought I could make up for my absence with expensive dinners and gifts. And you're doing the exact same thing with them." Edward sat down heavily in the armchair, running his hands over his face. "I don't know how to do it differently, Clara." "Then learn." "How?" Clara sat on the sofa, her expression softening a little. "Do you really want to be in their lives? Do you want to be a real father?" "I do," Edward said, and he realized it was the first time he'd said it with complete conviction. "I really do." "Then you need to understand that being a father isn't about giving things. It's about being present. It's about knowing their favorite color, what food they don't like, how they sleep, what they're afraid of, what makes them laugh." "I don't know any of that," Edward admitted, "because you never asked. You never sat on the floor with them and really talked. You offered toys instead of offering your attention." Clara leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "Edward, they don't need a rich man who shows up once in a while with expensive gifts. They need a father who is present, who participates in their lives, who knows them as people." "What if I don't know how to do that?" "Then you learn by doing. You make mistakes, you try again, you make more mistakes until you get it right. That's how being a parent works." Edward was silent for a long moment, processing her words. "Either you learn now," Clara said, her voice returning to its former firmness, "or you will lose them. And this time it will be forever, because they will grow up remembering that their father preferred to be a rich stranger than a real person in their lives." The words hit Edward with full force. He was faced with the same mistake he had made with Clara, thinking he could replace presents with money, quality time with expensive gifts. "And what do you want me to do?" he asked, finally. "I want you to spend a whole day with them, a real day, doing normal things that fathers do with their children, without spending money, without gifts, without trying to impress. Just be with them. A whole day. From 8 in the morning to 8 at night. 12 hours. And you can't talk about work, take business calls, or promise things you'll buy for them later." Edward swallowed hard. "What if I don't know what to do?" "Ask them. They'll teach you." Clara stood up and went to the window again. "Edward, you have one chance to be the father they deserve. But it's just one chance. If you mess this up, if they realize you're just going through the motions—" "I understand," Edward said, standing up as well. "When?" "Today. Now. 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 I'm going to get the girls from the neighbor's house, and you are going to spend the rest of the day with them. Here, at the park, wherever they want to go. But you'll go together, doing things together." Edward felt a mix of nervousness and determination. "All right, let's do this." Clara studied him for a moment, as if assessing his sincerity. "Edward, if you do this just to please me, or to fulfill an obligation, they will know. Children can sense when you're not really present, even if you're physically there." "I'll be present," Edward said, and this time he really meant it. "I want to get to know my daughters." Half an hour later, Edward found himself in Clara's small backyard with Emily and Sophie, with no idea what to do. The bicycles were leaning against the wall. Clara had insisted they wait until later. "So," Edward said, feeling ridiculously formal, "what do you like to do?" "You don't know?" Emily asked, tilting her head. "No, I don't. Why don't you tell me?" The girls looked at each other as if deciding whether they could trust him. "We like to go to the park," Sophie said finally. "Then let's go to the park." "Are you really going?" Emily asked, suspicious. "You're not going to say you have to work?" Edward crouched down to their level. "I'm not working today. Today is just for you." "Promise?" "I promise." And for the first time, Edward truly wanted to keep such a promise. The park was 2 blocks from the house. During the walk, Edward tried to ask simple questions. "What's your favorite color?" "Pink," Sophie said immediately. "Blue," Emily said, "but sometimes I like green too." "And what's your favorite food?" "Pasta," they both said at the same time, then laughed. "And the food you like least?" "Broccoli," Emily said, making a disgusted face. "I like broccoli," Sophie said, "but I don't like peas." Edward smiled, realizing he was genuinely interested in their answers. It was simple, basic information, but he had never bothered to ask before. At the park, the girls ran immediately to the swings. "Will you push us?" Sophie asked. "Of course." Edward stood behind the swings, gently pushing Emily and Sophie, listening to their laughter. It was a sound he realized he had never truly paid attention to before. Pure, genuine, infectious. "Higher!" Emily shouted. "Not too high," Edward said, instinctively worried. "Are you scared we'll fall?" Sophie asked. "A little. Mommy is too, but she pushes anyway." Edward pushed a little harder, and the laughter grew. There was something comforting about being there, simply doing something that made his daughters happy. After the swings, they wanted to show him how to climb the slide. "You have to climb up too," Emily said. "I'm too big for the slide." "No, you're not. Look, there's a big one over there." Edward looked at the larger slide and sighed. He was wearing expensive dress pants and a shirt that cost more than many people made in a week. "All right," he said, surprising himself. Climbing the slide was ridiculous. He barely fit, his legs were too long, and he probably looked like an idiot. But when he came down and saw Emily and Sophie clapping and laughing, he realized he didn't care one bit about how he looked. "Again!" Sophie shouted, and Edward climbed up again. After the park, they walked to a nearby open field. "Let's play hide and seek," Emily suggested. "How do you play?" Both of them stopped and looked at him in disbelief. "You don't know how to play hide and seek?" Sophie asked. No, Edward admitted. Can you teach me? For the next hour, Edward learned the rules of hide and seek, discovered it was surprisingly hard to find hiding places when you're 6 feet tall, and laughed more than he had in years. When he found Emily hiding behind a tree too thin to conceal her completely, she shouted, "You found me!" with such joy that Edward felt something warm spread through his chest. When it was his turn to hide and Sophie found him crouched behind a low bush, she said, "Daddy, you're too big to hide there," and laughed so hard she fell onto the grass. Daddy. She had said Daddy naturally, without thinking. And Edward realized that for the first time, the word didn't sound strange. As it started to get dark, they walked back to Clara's house. On the way, Sophie took his right hand and Emily took his left, and they walked like that for the 2 blocks. "Daddy," Emily said as they walked, "are you coming back tomorrow? Do you want me to come back?" "Yes," they both said at once. "Then I'll come back." "Even if you have work." Edward stopped walking and knelt in front of them. "Girls, I promise you I'm going to try to be a better father. I'm going to try to be more present. It won't be perfect at first because I'm still learning, but I promise I'll try." "Okay," Sophie said, and hugged him. Emily hesitated for a moment, then hugged him too. "You're nice when you're not talking about work," she said. Edward laughed. "Thanks. You're nice too." When they got home, Clara was waiting at the door. "How was it?" she asked. "So it was," Edward searched for the right words. "It was the best day I've had in a very long time. Daddy played hide and seek," Sophie shouted, running to Clara. "And he went down the slide," Emily added. Clara smiled, and Edward saw approval in her eyes. "That's great. Did you have fun?" "A lot," they both said. "Now go wash your hands for dinner. And then you can show Daddy the drawings you made yesterday." The girls ran inside the house. Edward stayed at the door with Clara. "How did I do?" he asked. "Look at them," Clara said. "They're happy, genuinely happy." "I think you did well." After a simple dinner, pasta with tomato sauce, which Edward discovered was indeed the girls' favorite food, Emily and Sophie disappeared into their room and came back with some papers. "We made a drawing for you," Sophie said, holding out a sheet of paper. Edward took the drawing and felt something stir in his chest. It was 3 stick figures, a tall man in the middle, 2 small girls, one on each side, all holding hands. There was a yellow sun in the corner, a square house with a red door, and what looked like colorful flowers scattered on the ground. "This is you," Emily said, pointing to the middle figure. "And this is us. And this says Daddy," Sophie said, pointing to some crooked letters under the male figure. Edward held the paper with slightly trembling hands. It was just a child's drawing, made with crayons on plain paper. It probably cost less than 50 cents in materials, but it was the most valuable gift he had ever received. "It's beautiful," he said, and realized his voice was choked with emotion. "Can I keep it?" "Of course," Emily said. "It's for you." "Do you really like it?" Sophie asked, seeking approval. Edward looked at the drawing again, then at the 2 girls watching him expectantly. For the first time since he found out he was a father, perhaps for the first time in his entire adult life, Edward Haynes felt genuinely, completely connected to other people. "I love it," he said, and this time he let the tears well up in his eyes. "It's the best gift I've ever gotten." And as he hugged Emily and Sophie, with the drawing still in his hand, Edward finally understood what it meant to truly feel like a father. 2 weeks had passed since the day at the park, and Edward had kept his promise to be more present. He visited the girls every day after work, even if only for an hour. He had eaten dinner at Clara's 3 times, played hide and seek in the backyard, and even helped with their homework. The drawing Emily and Sophie had made for him was framed on his office desk, right next to his financial monitors. Every time he looked at those stick figures holding hands, he felt a connection to something much bigger than spreadsheets and profits. On Thursday morning, Edward was reviewing reports when his phone rang. "Edward, it's Richard," said the voice on the other end of the line. Richard Thompson was one of the most important investors on the East Coast. "Richard, what a surprise." "Straight to the point. I have a proposal that might interest you. A deal that will triple your profits in the next 2 years. Edward sat up straighter in his chair. I'm listening. A commercial and residential complex in Miami, 20 towers, a shopping center, a recreation area. We're talking a return of almost 500 million in 3 years. Edward felt the familiar adrenaline of big business. Sounds interesting. What's the timeline? The Japanese investors are in town only today and tomorrow. If we want to close, it has to be tomorrow. Friday, 2 in the afternoon at the Continental Hotel. Edward jotted it down in his planner. Friday, 2 in the afternoon. I'll be there. Excellent. Edward, this is the kind of deal that defines a career. After hanging up, Edward stared at the note. $500 million. It was more money than he had made in the last 5 years combined. It was the perfect opportunity. He was so absorbed in the numbers that he almost didn't hear the phone ring again. Edward? It was Clara. Hi, Clara. I'm calling to remind you about the girls' and school performance, Friday at 2 in the afternoon. Edward felt his stomach clench. School performance. Edward, did you forget? They've been rehearsing for weeks. It's the most important event of the term. Emily is going to recite a poem and Sophie is going to sing a song. The memory came flooding back. The week before, Emily had come running up to him. Daddy, I'm going to say a poem at school. Can you come watch? And Sophie had added, I'm going to sing too. It's very important for the parents to be there. Edward had promised he would be there. Clara, something important came up at work. More important than your daughters? Edward looked at his planner. 2 in the afternoon, the same time on the same day. Clara, it's a very important contract, $500 million. With that money, I can secure the girls' future forever. Edward, you're doing it again. Doing what? Putting work before family? Thinking money can replace presence? It's not that. It's just that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And this is a once-in-a-lifetime performance too. They're 5 years old, Edward. This performance isn't going to happen again. You don't understand the magnitude of this deal. I understand that you're about to make the same choice that cost you our relationship 5 years ago. The line went silent. Edward, they've told all their friends that their daddy is going to be there. Emily drew a heart on the program with your name inside. Sophie practiced her song 15 times yesterday. Edward felt something tighten in his chest. Choose, Edward. This time, make the right choice. She hung up, leaving Edward alone with his decision. For the rest of the morning, Edward tried to focus on work, but he couldn't. $500 million versus a 1-hour school performance. Logically, there was no comparison. But every time he tried to convince himself, he heard Sophie's voice practicing, or saw Emily drawing a heart with his name on it. At lunchtime, he called Richard. Richard, about tomorrow. Is there any chance we can move the time? Impossible. The Japanese have a flight at 5. It's 2 o'clock or never, Edward. I see. Is there a problem? Edward looked at the framed drawing. The stick figure man in the middle, the 2 small girls, all holding hands. No problem. But when he hung up, Edward wasn't sure if he had told the truth. In the afternoon, he went to visit the girls as he always did. They were in the backyard practicing for the performance. Daddy, Sophie shouted. Want to hear my song? Sophie stood in the middle of the lawn and began to sing a song about friendship. Her small, clear voice filled the air. Did you like it? She asked when she finished. It was beautiful, Sophie. Now it's my turn, Emily said. She recited a poem about family, about having people who love you. Every word seemed chosen to strike Edward in the heart. You're going to be there tomorrow, right, Daddy? Sophie asked, holding his hand. Edward looked at her, then at Emily. I have a very important meeting at the same time. The smiles vanished from both their faces. But you promised, Emily said, her voice small. Sometimes work. You always choose work, Emily interrupted, crossing her little arms. Just like Mommy said. Emily, it's not like that. Yes, it is, she shouted, her eyes shining with tears. You said you would be different, but you're not. She ran inside the house. Sophie looked at Edward with disappointment. Can't you miss work just once? She asked. Edward knelt down to her level. Sophie, it's a very important meeting. With this money, I can buy beautiful things for you. I don't want things, Sophie said, shaking her head. I want you to come watch me sing." And then she too ran inside, leaving Edward alone. Clara appeared at the door. "They told me what happened." "Clara, you have to understand. I understand perfectly. You haven't changed at all. It's not about the money, it's about their future. Their future is being decided right now. When they find out whether they can trust their father or not." She came closer. "Do you want to know what their future will be if you miss tomorrow? They'll grow up knowing they can't count on you. They'll grow up thinking they aren't important enough. But with this contract, you'll have more money, but you will have lost your daughters. Forever." That night, Edward stayed late at the office, looking back and forth between the contract papers and the girl's drawing. $500 million versus a school performance. The old Edward would have known exactly what to do. Business came first, always. Opportunities like this didn't come along every day. But the old Edward didn't have daughters who drew hearts with his name in them. The old Edward didn't know what it was like to see pure disappointment in the eyes of people who trusted him completely. Edward picked up the drawing and studied it for the 100th time. 3 stick figures, holding hands, smiling. It was so simple, so pure. There were no contracts and no numbers, no complications, just a father and his 2 daughters together. That was what they wanted. Not $500 million, not extravagant gifts. They wanted him to be there, watching them shine. Edward picked up the phone and dialed Richard's number. "Richard, sorry to call so late." "Edward, is everything all right?" "Richard, I need to cancel the meeting tomorrow." There was a long silence. "Cancel? Edward, we're talking about $500 million. "I know, but I have something more important to do." "More important? What could possibly be more important than this?" Edward looked at the drawing again. "My daughters have a performance at school. They're counting on me." "Your daughters? Edward, you can see your daughters any time. This opportunity won't come again." "I know," Edward said, feeling completely at peace with his decision. "But I'm not going to miss this moment." "Edward, you're making the biggest mistake of your career." "No, Richard. For the first time in my life, I'm making the right choice." Edward hung up the phone. $500 million. Gone. The biggest opportunity of his life. Lost forever. And he had never felt better about a decision. On Friday at 2 in the afternoon, Edward was sitting in the 3rd row of the small school auditorium. He had arrived an hour early, securing a seat with a good view of the stage. He was nervous in a way he never was in business meetings. The lights dimmed and the performance began. One after another, small children took the stage. Edward watched it all, but his heart was racing, waiting for his daughters to appear. Finally, the teacher announced, "And now Emily Morrison will recite a poem about family." Edward sat up straighter in his chair. Emily appeared on stage wearing a light blue dress. She looked out at the audience, searching. Edward saw the exact moment she found him. Her eyes widened, a huge smile spread across her face, and she gave him a discreet wave. Edward waved back, his heart nearly bursting with pride. Emily recited the poem perfectly, each word clear and expressive. When she finished, Edward applauded louder than anyone else in the audience. Then it was Sophie's turn. When they called her to sing, she practically bounced onto the stage, wearing a pink dress. She also searched the audience, and when she found Edward, her smile was so bright it lit up the entire auditorium. Sophie's song about friendship was sung with such pure joy that it brought tears to Edward's eyes. She was singing to him, every note directed to where he was sitting. When the performance was over, Edward waited outside the auditorium. Then he saw them. Emily and Sophie ran through the door, searching the crowd. When they finally saw him, they stopped for a fraction of a second, as if they couldn't believe it. Then they ran. "Daddy!" they both shouted at the same time. "Daddy, you came!" They threw themselves into his arms with such force they nearly knocked him over. Edward lifted them off the ground, one in each arm, holding them tight against his chest. "You really came," Emily said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Did you like my song?" Sophie asked, pulling back to look at him. Edward set them down but remained crouched at their level. "Say it was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life," he said, and realized he was crying. "Daddy, are you crying?" Emily asked, concerned. "I am," Edward said, not trying to hide his tears. "I'm crying because I am so proud of you both." "Really?" Sophie asked. "Really? You are the most talented girls in the whole world." They hugged him again, and Edward didn't care one bit that dozens of other parents were watching. He didn't care that he was crying in public, that his image as a powerful businessman was being completely shattered. None of that mattered. The only thing that mattered were the two little girls in his arms who had trusted that he would be there for them. And he had been. Clara approached, smiling. "How was the meeting?" she asked, but Edward could see she already knew the answer. "What meeting?" Edward said, still holding the girls. "I had something much more important to do today." And for the first time in his life, Edward Haynes knew he had made the absolute right choice. 3 months had passed since the school performance, and Edward's life had changed in ways he never imagined possible. The man who once worked until 11 at night now left the office at 5:30 sharp, no matter how many meetings were scheduled or how many contracts needed review. His employees had found the change strange at first. Edward Haynes, the legendary workaholic, turning down meetings after 6 p.m., cancelling business trips on weekends. But they soon got used to their boss's new routine, and many commented that he seemed more relaxed, more human. Edward had established a routine that worked for both him and the girls. Every morning, before work, he would stop by Clara's house to have breakfast with Emily and Sophie. It was always something simple, cereal, toast, juice, but it had become his favorite part of the day. The girls would talk about their dreams, what they were looking forward to at school, and Edward would listen, soaking up every word like gold. In the afternoon, without exception, he picked them up from school. The first few days, other parents looked curiously at the man in the expensive suit waiting in line. But soon, Edward became part of the school routine, known as Emily and Sophie's dad, who always arrived promptly at 3:15. On the way home, the girls would talk about their day at school, about their friends, their lessons, the games at recess. Edward learned more about his daughters, lives on those 15-minute walks than he had in all the previous months. Weekends became sacred. Saturdays were for adventures, parks, the zoo, the science museum, or walks around the neighborhood. Sundays were for staying home, lazy and comfortable, and Edward had bought a low table specifically for drawing on the floor of Clara's living room, where he would spend hours coloring in children's books and creating masterpieces with crayons. The most surprising thing was discovering how easy it was to balance work and family when he truly committed. He became more efficient at the office, focused and direct. Meetings that once lasted 2 hours were now resolved in 40 minutes. Decisions he used to postpone for days were made quickly. Having limited time forced him to be better at his job, not worse. Clara had also experienced significant changes. 2 weeks after the school performance, she landed a job as an administrative coordinator at a medical clinic. The salary was better than any previous job, and the hours allowed her to be present in the girls' lives. Financial independence brought back a confidence Clara hadn't felt in years. She was able to make small improvements to the house, a new coat of paint for the living room, new curtains, a better tended garden. They weren't extravagant changes, but they represented stability and hope. Most importantly was seeing how Emily and Sophie had blossomed over the past few months. The girls, who once carried a subtle sadness for not having a present father, now radiated happiness. They ran to the door every afternoon when they heard Edward's car pull up. They spoke of him with pride to their friends at school. They drew our family with 4 people, always holding hands. Clara watched Edward's transformation with joy and relief. The man she had loved years ago had finally found a balance that seemed impossible when they were younger. He was still ambitious and successful, but now he knew there were things more important than money and contracts. One Sunday afternoon, all 4 of them were in Clara's living room, spread out on a colorful rug on the floor. Emily and Sophie had convinced Edward and Clara to participate in a drawing contest, where everyone had to draw their version of the family. "No looking at each other's drawings," ordered Emily, always the organizer. "Everyone makes their own." Edward found himself lying on his stomach on the rug, crayons beside him, trying to draw 4 recognizable figures, He had no artistic talent, but he had learned that with the girls the effort was more important than the result. "Done?" Sophie announced after 15 minutes. "Who wants to show first?" "Me," said Emily, holding up her paper. It was a typical child's drawing, 4 stick figures in front of a square house, with a smiling sun in the corner. But this time, Edward noticed, all the figures were the same size, and they were all holding hands. "Beautiful, Emily," Clara said. "And now it's Sophie's turn." Sophie's drawing was similar but included flowers in the garden, a dog, though they didn't have one, and hearts floating above the figures. "Heads." "My turn," said Clara, showing her drawing of the family sitting at the dinner table, all smiling. "Now, Daddy," Sophie said, throwing herself down next to Edward. Edward turned his paper over, revealing 4 figures that were clearly the work of a talentless adult trying to draw like a child. The proportions were all wrong, and he had spent so much time trying to make detailed faces that the figures looked haunted. Emily and Sophie burst into laughter. "Daddy, why does Mommy have 3 eyes?" Emily asked. "And why am I bigger than you?" Sophie added. Edward looked at his drawing and started laughing too. "I guess I don't have a talent for art." "That's okay," Emily said, hugging his arm. "We'll teach you." "Yeah," Sophie agreed. "You just need more practice." Clara watched the scene with a smile. Seeing Edward on the floor, laughing at himself, completely unconcerned with his image, was something she had never imagined possible. "How about we put all the drawings on the fridge?" she suggested. "Yes!" the girls shouted in unison. While Clara and the girls arranged the drawings in the kitchen, Edward remained alone in the living room, watching through the doorway. Sophie was on her tiptoes, trying to reach a magnet on the fridge, while Emily held the drawings. Clara helped them patiently, laughing at something Sophie had said, his family. The word still sounded strange and wonderful. Edward thought about the last few months, about how his life had completely changed. He thought about the $500 million deal he had lost and realized he didn't even miss the money. He thought about all the years building an empire, accumulating wealth, always chasing the next big deal. And then he looked at his daughters taping drawings to the fridge, radiant with happiness over a simple afternoon of drawing on the floor. When the girls came running back into the living room, throwing themselves into his arms for a group hug, Edward felt an absolute clarity about what truly mattered in life. "Daddy," Emily said, snuggled against his chest, "are you staying for dinner?" "If Mommy lets me," Edward replied, looking at Clara. "Of course you can," Clara said. "Says, but you're helping cook." "I can make pasta," Edward offered. "You know how to make pasta?" Sophie asked, impressed. "I know how to boil water," Edward admitted. "You can teach me the rest." As they headed to the kitchen, with Emily and Sophie each holding one of his hands, Edward reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had spent decades constructing buildings, accumulating properties, creating a legacy he thought was permanent. But now he knew the truth. My greatest legacy isn't my buildings, but these girls who taught me how to be a father. And for the first time in his life, Edward Haynes was truly home. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.